has changed. Nothing has changed.
The best way to honour the memory of Joe Cox would be, I think, to get Brexit done.
Yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way.
I think the people of this country have had enough of experts.
I know the plan put forward only 10 days ago has caused a little turbulence. I get it. From the crash of 2008 onwards, can you think of anybody who stuck up for the bankers as much as I did?
I broke the social distancing guidelines. That happened because I fell in love.
Here in Uxbridge today, Boris Johnson's constituency.
Did you ever mention that name in front of me, that filthy piece of toe rag?
Good evening. We're gathered here today in memory of all the Conservative MPs who didn't make it to this election because they either quit, got fired, or simply didn't want to face the voters in this election. Because I think it would be wrong to allow them to simply slink off into the background after all the damage they've done without giving the country a chance to fully acknowledge who these people are in our history. And not just wrong, it would be dangerous if we didn't learn the lessons of the last 14 years. And while we don't have time to go through all the nearly 80 MPs who won't be standing in this election, here are the Conservative MPs who I believe taught us lessons that will be extremely valuable in the years to come. Because with hundreds of thousands of lives lost due to austerity, tens of thousands of avoidable deaths with COVID, and the economic and societal nightmare of Brexit, if we're not getting justice, we better at least learn from this. First we have George Eustice, aka George Useless. He taught us that when politicians don't have any principles, it's the ordinary people that suffer. He began his political career with UKIP, a party whose main reason for wanting us out of the EU was reducing immigration. And yet when Brexit happened and we ended up with major labour shortages, he was the one telling us that we needed more immigration. And then despite the fact that his Brexit was making food more expensive, even though people were promised that it would make food less expensive, when food prices were set to rise again, he said,
"It's going to rise again now, but generally speaking, what people find is that by going for some of the sort of value brands rather than, own branded products, they can actually sort of contain and manage their household budget."
Because the problem was we're not shopping correctly. May he never know rest or peace. Sajid Javid, he taught us that the worst politicians often become successful because the politicians that you'd expect to be sensible support them. Like when Boris Johnson was lying about partying during lockdown.
When the first stories of parties in Downing Street emerged late last year, I was personally assured at the most senior level by my right honourable friend's then team that, and I quote, "There had been no parties in Downing Street and no rules were broken." So I gave the benefit of doubt. And I went on those media rounds to say that I'd had those assurances from the most senior level of the Prime Minister's team. Then we had more stories.
And when Boris Johnson argued that Ukrainians fighting Russia was just like us voting for Brexit.
I don't think in any way he was connecting the situations in Ukraine and the UK.
It's the instinct of the people of this country, like the people of Ukraine, to choose freedom every time. I can give you a couple of famous recent examples. When the British people voted for Brexit...
And he wasn't saying... I think it's spurious to say that he was connecting somehow the UK and Ukraine in that way.
It's the instinct of the people of this country, like the people of Ukraine, to choose freedom every time. I can give you a couple of famous recent examples. When the British people voted for Brexit...
May he never know rest or peace. Matt Hancock, he was the health secretary during the pandemic. And during the first year, £18 billion of contracts were awarded to companies to help us with the pandemic. And, according to Transparency International, 99% of the contracts they paid for using our money were awarded without any competition process to make sure those companies could actually do the job. And there was a special VIP lane for companies with known connections to the Conservative Party, a VIP lane that was later found to be unlawful. And because under Matt Hancock, they prioritised giving money to companies that had connections to them, they ended up spending hundreds of millions of pounds of our money during a crisis on PPE, so medical equipment, that didn't actually work. So while doctors were covering themselves with bin bags to make up for the fact that they didn't have the protection they needed, the Tories were getting rich off this. And that happened while Matt Hancock was our health secretary. And while millions of people were making the sacrifice of not seeing their loved ones, not going to funerals, not going to births, because of the rules of lockdown that Matt Hancock imposed on them, he was having an affair with a colleague. And his excuse...
That happened because I fell in love.
And yet he still felt entitled to go on national TV platforms without being asked about it.
But I'm also now perfectly willing and totally within my rights to say, But you chose to be in public life. But I think it's also reasonable to say enough is enough.
Including trying to get back his popularity by going on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here while he was supposed to be working in Parliament. May he never know rest or peace. Dominic Raab. He taught us that some politicians will say whatever it takes to achieve their goals, and then when the reality doesn't match their promises, they'll simply change their narrative to suit it. Like in 2016, when he was telling people to vote for Brexit, he said,
"Do you accept that whatever our relationship is with the EU, if we leave the EU, that we can have no full access to the single market unless we agree to free movement of peoples?"
It depends what you mean by full access to the single market. I think we would not see any trade barriers go up because we're the 5th biggest economy in the world.
And then when businesses started to suffer because of the chaos of Brexit, he blamed them instead.
Well, I think it's probably rather easy at this moment in time for any businesses that isn't doing rather well to point to Brexit. It's rather easy for a business to blame Brexit and the politicians rather than to take responsibility for their own situation.
And then when the Brexit deal that he negotiated started ruining British businesses, he denied it was anything to do with Brexit.
The Scottish fishing industry in particular is drowning under red tape. Let me just read you 2 examples. Jamie McMillan of Lochfine Langoustines. "We have no sales to the EU, our biggest market for live shellfish in the last 2 weeks. If we go another week without that, we are finished." And Donna Fordyce, who's Chief Executive of Seafood Scotland, says some businesses, which may have been run by families for generations, are now days away from collapse as a result of the agreement you have struck.
Well, I'm not convinced that that's a result of the agreement.
And then when the damage of Brexit became too big for even him to deny, he said it wasn't a big deal.
And there are lots of pieces of evidence now, again, hard evidence of actual companies moving hundreds of people out of the city and onto the continent of Europe. Given that the EU wants to take that business into its own territory, we don't have many levers to, as it were, use against them.
The crucial question for the EU, it may be able to, if you like, nick a bit of business here or there.
But he also taught us what it means when politicians lie, because it doesn't always mean that they're saying things that they know for a fact aren't true. It can mean that they're saying things that they have no reason to believe are true because they simply haven't bothered to check. Like, imagine telling people that Brexit wouldn't damage our trade with the EU at all, and then coming out with a line like this.
And I hadn't quite understood the full extent of this, but if you look at the UK and you look at how we trade in goods, we're particularly reliant on the Dover-Calais crossing. And that's one of the reasons why, and there's been a lot of controversy about this, but one of the reasons why we've wanted to make sure that we have a specific and very proximate relationship with the EU to ensure frictionless trade at the border, particularly for just-in-time manufacturing goods, whether it's pharmaceutical goods or perishable goods like food. I don't think it's a question so much of the risk of major shortages, but I think probably the average consumer might not be aware of the full extent to which the choice of goods that we have in the stores are dependent on 1 or 2 very specific trade routes. And I hadn't quite understood the full extent of this, but if you look at the UK and you look at how we trade in goods, we're particularly reliant on the Dover-Calais crossing.
Or imagine being 2 years into the negotiations of Brexit, a Brexit where you know the peace process in Northern Ireland has been a major issue, a Brexit which even Dominic Raab himself admitted later
is clearly posing a threat to the Good Friday Agreement.
And then when you're asked whether you've read the Good Friday Agreement upon which peace in Northern Ireland is based, you say,
"Since you had such a critical role as the Brexit Secretary, I presume that in fact you had read the Belfast Agreement. Please don't line up behind the Immigration Minister and tell us that you haven't read the agreement."
I haven't sit down and started at the beginning and gone through it, but of course at various points in the negotiations, when issues have been raised, it has been an important opportunity to delve in to the different aspects, look very carefully.
So which aspects of so you haven't read the Belfast Agreement in its entirety?
I haven't sat down and gone from, I've used it as a reference tool.
And during the pandemic, he was the first Tory politician to really say with his whole chest, yes, it is one rule for us and another for the public.
It's out there and people will be reasonably saying, you're not allowing me to gather with my friends and family at a wedding or a funeral, but look at what you guys are doing.
In fairness, there have always been different principles for social entertainment or weddings than for government business.
But to his credit, Dominic Raab has always been very upfront about who and what he is.
My name's Dominic Raab. I'm the author of The Assault on Liberty, and I'm a Tory.
I don't support the Human Rights Act, and I don't believe in economic and social rights.
Called feminists obnoxious bigots, and when it came to people who use food banks...
The typical user of a food bank is not someone that's languishing in poverty, it's someone who has a cash flow problem episodically. No, it's true. Well,
and his response to facing 24 allegations of bullying was to effectively threaten the whole country. May he never know rest or peace. Bill Cash, he taught us that there is no limit to the way that some politicians will bend over backwards to protect one of their mates. Even to the point of arguing that attending multiple parties during a pandemic lockdown doesn't tell us anything about Boris Johnson's character.
That a fixed penalty notice, such as in his own case, is a civil penalty fine, which if paid within 28 days, eliminates future prosecution in the criminal courts, and furthermore without any admission of guilt. In a recent criminal case, in a recent criminal appeal case, and in that judgment, it was said that if the payment was made within those 28 days, a fixed penalty notice was held not to be a conviction, as the defendant, to quote the court's judgment, quote, was not admitting an offence or criminality and would have no stain imputed to his character.
He's also an example of a politician who argued for Brexit for 30 years and was on record as saying that it would make us poorer, but it would be worth it. But when it came to the referendum, he argued that Brexit would save us from poverty. And when Brexit ultimately did make us poorer, he had literally nothing to say back to it. Has it actually made life better, economically, financially? People going through a cost of living crisis.
No, they're doing it going through a cost of living crisis, not because of Brexit, but because of COVID.
Yeah, but
because if you've got to repay £400 billion pounds...
No one issue is ever going to be the sole factor in somebody's quality of life. I'm asking about Brexit specifically.
Yes, I am.
Has Brexit made things better or worse?
Brexit isn't about self-government, it's about democracy.
Economically speaking.
And the responsibility lies with the people through the elected government.
Since you're not answering that question...
I am answering the question.
Well, you haven't
already done so.
In economic terms, your OBR, the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, so essentially your economic brain, has said that Brexit has caused more damage long-term to our economy than COVID.
No, I'm afraid that is just simply wrong.
Why?
Well,
on what basis?
Because the decisions were taken on the basis of the amount of money that was made available through furlough, the cost of the vaccines, all these other things.
At no point have you given a counter-argument to the principle that it's made life better.
I have given a very good counter-argument, and I'm very happy.
But you haven't made an economic argument for Brexit, though.
I certainly have. Because
you've talked about sovereignty, you've talked about democracy, you've talked about where laws are made. Yeah, but when I give you actual economic advice, so for example, the Federation of Small Businesses, so representing UK businesses, a quarter of them small businesses stop selling with the EU because of Brexit.
The reality is that these are decisions which are being taken by government in relation to
businesses,
by international trading opportunities which are being
by UK British businesses that are suffering because of your policies.
No, that's not the case. Anyway,
but they're saying it's the case. He also taught us that the same conservatives who claim to be the champions of free speech will be the same people who tell the BBC to fire Gary Lineker for criticising them.
And people such as him should not be put in a position where they can use their influence and their arguments, which in this case are completely outrageous, to make remarks against government ministers. And it's up to the BBC to get a grip of this, get an completely independent complaints unit, and work with Ofcom to make sure that this does not happen ever again. And if he has to go, he has to go.
May he never know rest or peace. Alok Sharma. He taught us that every party will put somebody in charge of fighting climate change because they have to. Gen Z would recycle their bones if they didn't. But that doesn't mean they actually care about climate change. Alok Sharma was the UK lead for the COP Climate Summit. And not only did he take 30 international flights in 7 months, but he defended cutting taxes on flights within the UK.
Domestic aviation represents less than 1% of our emissions in 2019.
So even if you argue that he had to fly to meet other world leaders, who was he helping by making it cheaper to fly within the UK? Because it's not working class people. If working class people need to go from Birmingham to Edinburgh, that's a train or megabus job. And as we transition to a greener economy, there's going to have to be choices made about who pays for that, rich people or poor people. And conservative politicians will tell you that going green hurts working class people, but that's a choice that's being made by people like Alok Sharma. May he never know rest or peace. Chris Grayling, he's the exception to the rule. You know the principle of Hanlon's razor, which says that if somebody does something bad, rather than assume that they're just a bad person, it's better to assume they're just stupid. Well, the Tories are the exception to that rule because they all signed up to Brexit in 2019, even though their own experts said that any version of Brexit would make people poorer. So they are all bad people. So we can use their lack of morality to explain pretty much all their actions, but with Chris Grayling, he got the name Failing Grayling because his actions can only really be explained by stupidity. The man literally failed at failing to fail. Follow me on this. The Tories sold us Brexit on the basis that we'd get an amazing deal with the EU that wouldn't damage our trade. But then the negotiations went so badly that the government had to start preparing for a catastrophic no-deal Brexit. Failure number one. So Chris Grayling gave £13 million to a ferry company so that when Brexit red tape slowed things down in Dover, they would still have the capacity to ferry across all the stuff that we needed from Europe. But the ferry company he hired didn't actually have any ferries. They'd stolen their terms and conditions from a pizza delivery company, which means he failed at trying to prepare for negotiations to fail. Failure number two. And then he tried to prepare for what would happen if he wasn't able to increase the capacity in Dover to cope with failed Brexit negotiations and lorries started backing up all the way along the motorway. So he tried to stage a pretend traffic jam as a dry run for the 6,000 lorry queue that a no-deal Brexit would create, but only 89 lorries showed up. So he failed to prepare for the consequences of him failing to prepare for failed Brexit negotiations. It's a Poundland version of Inception. May he never know rest or peace. Kwasi Kwarteng. Now, while it would be easy to point out that he was the Chancellor, i.e. the main money man in government, who announced the mini-budget that crashed the pound to the lowest level for 37 years, that wasn't really him. That was Liz Truss following the advice of the IEA, whose comms director she hired as a special advisor. The IEA think tank is basically a bunch of disaster capitalist Brexit nutters, so what we learned from this is the need to question who's really calling the shots. Because I remember when the economy crashed with the mini-budget, and he was left holding the bag, and so I was like,
seen this movie, the black dude dies first.
Kwasi Kwarteng also taught us that it's important to have rules on politicians accepting money from places that aren't the public. Like when he tried to work for a fake South Korean company that was set up by led by donkeys.
I mean, we would definitely will be willing to pay the top of the range. So.
Okay. Well, it's particularly if I'm going to Korea, I'd like to be compensated for that.
Yes, definitely. We will arrange all the compensations and all that. So
yeah, I mean, I'm 10,000 a day, and I'll invoice it each.
Kwasi Kwarteng is also an important example of the principle that not all skin folk are kinfolk. Just because he's black doesn't mean he stands up for black people or he's even a good person. There are crappy people at every notch on the Dulux color palette. They will support racism if it gets them ahead. So Kwasi Kwarteng had absolutely no problem supporting a prime minister who said that Barack Obama had a part Kenyan's ancestral dislike of the British Empire and supporting a government that the United Nations says is deliberately trying to normalize white supremacy. But his greatest contribution was how he proudly announced almost every aspect of his government's fascism in less than 100 seconds. This is the interview that he gave after the Supreme Court said that Boris Johnson had acted unlawfully by shutting down Parliament, which Kwasi Kwarteng refers to as prorogation, which he'd done in order to try and force through a no-deal Brexit by running out the clock.
This Brexit process has brought the courts, has brought judges, has brought lawyers into the political process to a far greater extent than any of us have ever seen. We've had people contesting judgments, people contesting the right of the Prime Minister or the circumstances in which he pushes a prorogation.
Now that bit's actually true, he just doesn't mean it the way that you and I heard it. Because yes, it is the Brexit process, led by him and the rest of the Tories, that has brought judges and lawyers into politics in a way that we haven't seen before. Mainly because the way that they conducted the Brexit process has broken laws on a scale that we've never seen before. For starters, the winning campaign, Vote Leave, that got them the Brexit vote that their entire government is based upon, broke the law during the referendum by overspending by £449,000. And Kwasi Kwarteng is sitting there defending Boris Johnson for unlawfully shutting down our entire democracy to get his own way. Remember, two key elements of fascism, a disregard for the law and a disregard for the institutions of democracy. And he managed to tick both of those boxes in the first 15 seconds.
Is that the more that courts get involved in politics, that is a detriment not only to politics, but also to the court.
Again, he's being truthful, he's just framing things like a criminal. Like he's acting like the problem is the justice system, not the crimes that he and his mates keep committing. Like a Scooby-Doo villain complaining about the meddling kids. Because the truth is, yes, the more law-breaking there is in politics, the more it damages politics and our faith in it. So stop breaking the law then.
Because many people are saying, I'm not saying this, but many people, and I'm sure Nigel Farage might have a view on this, many people are saying that the judges are biased. The judges are getting involved in politics. I'm just saying what people are saying. That's what people are saying.
Oh, I'm not sure if you caught that. He's not the one saying it. It's the people saying it. Not him. Not him, of course. No. He's just the voice of the people. Remember, a key part of fascism is populism, claiming to be the voice of the people, when really you're just pushing a very specific agenda. Whose agenda?
And I'm sure Nigel Farage might have a view on this.
Nigel Farage was constantly trying to turn people against the judges, basically saying that the law was getting in the way of what he claimed was the will of the people. And the Tories only called the referendum and started this whole Brexit mess because they were trying to take back some voters from UKIP under Farage. So just like with Truss's mini budget, the ideas that Kwasi Kwarteng was pushing weren't coming from him. This was Nigel Farage's playbook. So as we look to the future, let's not pretend that Nigel Farage and the Reform Party have clean hands in this Tory disaster. They wrote the script.
We have never seen a situation like this, where judges and lawyers are being appealed to all the time, effectively to overturn democratic mandates.
So he's complaining that people were asking judges and lawyers to undermine the democratic will of the people, right? But this was about preventing no deal, an even more extreme version of Brexit than the one we ended up with. A version that Boris Johnson literally promised people would never happen when he was telling them to vote for Brexit.
All those who say that there would be barriers to trade with Europe if we were to do a Brexit. It is totally and utterly absurd.
I even asked Kwasi Kwarteng to his face whether the people who voted for Brexit would have voted for a no-deal Brexit, which would tell us whether by stopping no-deal Brexit, those judges were undermining the will of the people or protecting it. Do you think people voted for no deal?
I think people voted to leave the EU.
But specifically without a deal?
I think they voted to leave the EU. Whether we leave with a deal or without a deal is a secondary.
So all 17 million voters would have been happy with leaving without a deal? Would they all have been happy with leaving without a deal? Because if they wouldn't, then there isn't a majority for no deal. Okay, what would you say to the idea that in 2017, the majority of voters chose parties whose manifestos explicitly opposed no deal? So if Parliament were to leave without a deal, it would be going against its elected mandate. He had nothing. No evidence at all that the judges were blocking the will of anybody except the Tories and Nigel Farage. And let's be clear, the Tories back then had 42% of the vote. Together with the DUP on less than 1% of the vote, they had a controlling majority in Parliament because of our voting system. But that means they literally didn't represent the people. The majority of people, in fact 54.5% of people, had voted for parties in 2017 whose manifestos explicitly ruled out no-deal Brexit. And yet he was complaining that people from the majority were daring to use lawyers to stop him from doing something that he and his party had promised would never happen. And this right here is the most critical part of fascism, and intolerance of anybody else's viewpoints. May he never know rest or peace. Paul Scully, he showed us that the far right in countries across the world are simply copying each other's notes, even if it doesn't make sense. The line about no-go areas for non-Muslims is ripped straight from Fox News, and he said this about parts of London and Birmingham. Birmingham where I live, where I am right now, and Spark Hill, which I had to go through to get here to film this. He taught us that the far right will say things that they think will convince you, even if you can see with your own eyes that those things aren't true. May he never know rest or peace. Theresa May. The anti-immigration rhetoric that you hear today, she was really the pioneer of that. As Home Secretary, her Home Office deliberately set out to create a hostile environment for anybody who didn't have their visa paperwork in order, like stopping businesses from dealing with anybody who couldn't prove they had the right to be in the UK, and sending vans that had signs on them saying "Go home" through immigrant neighbourhoods, while also making the process of getting a visa harder and more expensive. And that hostility led to over 80 Jamaican people being wrongfully deported, even though the reason they were in the UK to begin with was because the UK government invited Jamaicans to help rebuild the country after World War II. And Theresa May was also a major part of the hostility towards the Human Rights Act. The Tories have been attacking international human rights laws for a long time, the laws that are there to prevent governments from hurting people. The European Convention on Human Rights was drafted in 1950, just a few years after the Holocaust, so you can see why it might have come about. And the Human Rights Act is basically the UK translation of that. And Theresa May was calling for the Human Rights Act to be scrapped in 2011, before Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak even became MPs. So the agendas that these people are pushing, they aren't new, they're scarily old. Like the Reform Party, who also want to get rid of the Human Rights Act. But look who's running that party, Richard Tice and Nigel Farage. And their old communications director, Andy Wigmore, said the tactics they use were basically the modern equivalent of the Nazis.
You know, the propaganda machine of you know, the Nazis, for instance. If you take away all the hideous horror and all that kind of stuff, it was very clever. The way they managed to do what they did.
Of course.
And you know, if in its pure marketing sense, think, oh, okay.
Yeah.
You can see the logic of it.
Absolutely.
They were saying how they presented things, the imagery, everything from that.
Yeah.
Okay. And that is propaganda. Interestingly.
12 steps or whatever it is. Yeah.
I know. And well, you know this.
Yeah.
But I, you know, looking at that in hindsight now, being in the sharp end of this campaign, is crikey. You know, this is not new.
No.
And it's using the tools that you've...
And Theresa May helped lay the groundwork for them, just like she did for Boris Johnson and Brexit when she was Prime Minister. Because she was Prime Minister during most of the Brexit negotiations, and you've heard me say before, there was only really one way that any sensible leader could have reacted to the referendum result. And that was to acknowledge that Brexit could be anything from no deal at all with the EU to being like Norway, where you're not in the EU, but you still follow the same rules in order to protect trade. And so without any guarantee that the Brexit they ultimately negotiated would be more popular than EU membership, the only way to do Brexit democratically would be to negotiate the deal first and then have a referendum between that negotiated deal and remaining in the EU. Instead, Theresa May negotiated a version of Brexit that was so hated by Brexit voters that UKIP marched against it. Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg both said it was worse than remaining in the EU.
In this arrangement, we can only leave the customs union with the permission of the European Union, which is a worse situation than we're currently in.
This is just about as bad as it could possibly be. Accepting EU rules but are unable to shape them.
And when Parliament voted on it, it suffered the worst defeat in the history of the UK. So it didn't have the support of the 48% who voted against Brexit or the 52% who voted for Brexit. And yet she tried to force it on the country by deliberately running down the clock so that everybody would end up completely exhausted by the topic. Because let's face it, when you hear Brexit, you think, this again? Well, she's the reason why. She hogged the ball for 2 years, refusing to let anybody else have a say. And it's that frustration that paved the way for Boris Johnson to take over by promising to get Brexit done. So may she never know rest or peace. Brandon Lewis, I said before that a key part of fascism is a disrespect for the law. Well, he's probably the most famous example of the Tories basically saying, yeah, we're international criminals, come at us. Because this is what he said about the Tory Brexit policy in relation to Northern Ireland.
Yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way.
Nadhim Zahawi, now he really does set records when it comes to a total lack of morality. And I don't just mean the fact that while he was Chancellor, so the guy who was in charge of our taxes, he got fined £5 million by HMRC for not paying his taxes. I mean that when cabinet ministers were resigning en masse because Boris Johnson had hired Chris Pincher to be the deputy chief whip of the party, so in charge of the party's discipline, even though he knew that there were multiple allegations of sexual misconduct against Chris Pincher, calling him Pincher by name, Pincher by nature. Nadine Zahawi then took a cabinet job in Boris Johnson's disgraced government and then went on TV to defend him.
Do you think this Prime Minister has integrity?
I do. I think he...
So we need to know.
Well, because he's determined to deliver for this country. The people, by the way, who are egging us on to divide and to turn on one another are people like Alistair Campbell. And wherever Alistair Campbell is, you want to be on the opposite side of the argument, in my view. By the way, this is a team game, and you play for the team and you deliver for the nation. Okay. Right? The Prime Minister is right.
It's a sex pest.
He is right. The Prime Minister was right to apologise and say that, with the benefit of hindsight, it was the wrong appointment. We make decisions.
You said Pincher by name, Pincher by nature. And you want to serve as this man's Chancellor?
Okay, we make decisions at warp speed in government. There are no easy decisions. to make.
And then as even more cabinet ministers resigned, and so it looked like Boris Johnson simply wasn't going to have enough people to run a government, just 24 hours after Nadhim Zahawi went on TV to defend Boris Johnson, he published a letter condemning Boris Johnson and calling for him to quit. So we are talking absolutely zero morals here. Happy to be hired by somebody who knowingly hires sex pests, and then within hours of that, claim to be outraged by it. And you need to know that because it tells you the kind of people that the Tories hire when they want to claim to be racially diverse. Because that's not the only time he defended Boris Johnson.
This is a Prime Minister who's said that he likened Muslim women to letterboxes and bank robbers.
Well, it's also the Prime Minister that has promoted Nadine Zahawi to Secretary of State of Education, Sajid Javid to Health Secretary.
In that clip, he was told about the clearly anti-Muslim rhetoric of that government, and so he explicitly used his presence in the government as proof that they're not bigoted. He knew the role he was playing. The Chris Pincher story proves that there is nothing he wouldn't support if it meant getting a government job. And in this case, he was happy to use himself as the token brown guy to give Boris Johnson a get-out-of-racism free card. Nadhim Zahawi showed us we need to be smarter about racism in politics, that racist politicians and media will use black and brown faces to pretend to be tolerant even though they actually don't give a crap about black and brown people. For example,
how many black people are in the current cabinet?
There's a whole series of people from a black and minority ethnic background. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Home Secretary, to name but two.
I'm just talking about blacks. I'm talking about black people specifically because I do think it's quite important not to lump everyone from non-white backgrounds together, because obviously Asian people, for example, face prejudice too, but it might be a different prejudice to that faced by black people.
Well, I think that Boris Johnson has got a very good record on this, and it brings people in and listens to a diversity of views, and it's diversity of thought that's the really important thing when you're taking those big decisions around the cabinet table.
So actually, are you saying then that people from black backgrounds shouldn't really worry that there isn't a single person from a black background at the current cabinet table because you have diversity of thought?
So as for Nadhim Zahawi, may he never know rest or peace. Chris Heaton-Harris, he began the mafia era of the Tory party, because back in 2017, when it was clear to everybody that Brexit was going off the rails, he wrote a letter to all UK universities demanding a list of all academics teaching about Brexit and what they were teaching. When a government starts putting academics on lists because they criticise them, the dinner bell of fascism has truly been rung. So Chris Heaton-Harris, may he never know rest or peace. John Redwood, as you know, is a personal one for me, because in 2016 he was so bold that leaving the EU would make us better off.
We will be better off out. The first thing that will happen is we will get back the £10,000 million a year.
And 2 years later, this happened.
John Redwood is here to help me with all this. A former Cabinet Minister, Conservative MP for Wokingham, of course. Femi, if I can start with you.
Their own experts say that every possible Brexit scenario leaves this country financially, economically worse off, which means that right now what they're trying to do is something that they know will harm the country. That makes it official Tory policy to harm the country. So of course they can't find a position because there's nothing that's going to actually be acceptable to the British people.
OK, John Redwood, if you'd like to respond to that. Good afternoon to you.
No, I don't think I'll respond to that. I wasn't told we were having a debate. You asked me to do an interview on what the options are for our future trading arrangement, and I'm very happy to talk about that.
And there are two things to learn from that. One, these people are country-destroying cowards who will run away from anybody who will actually hold them to account. But also that our media needs to stop letting politicians set the terms of how they talk to the country. Because John Redwood was still allowed to speak about Brexit on the radio that day. He simply refused to debate me directly, and that has happened several times over the last few years. Tory MP Andrew Bridgen pulled out of a debate with me last minute. Tory MEP Dan Hannan pulled out of a debate with me because the night before I'd posted a clip of him saying that if we left the EU, it wouldn't damage our trade at all because
absolutely nobody is talking about threatening our place in the single market.
And yet, like John Redwood, he was still allowed his time on air. If politicians want to go on national media, they should be forced to debate whoever they're told to. They shouldn't get to decide how they're held to account. So as for John Redwood, for refusing to debate somebody who could prove that he knew he was deliberately damaging the country, may he never know rest or peace. Michael Gove, he is without a doubt the slimiest politician to ever grace this green earth. He turned avoiding the question into masterpiece theatre, like when he was asked whether he would still go for a no-deal Brexit if Parliament made it illegal.
If this legislation goes through Parliament, both houses of Parliament, does the government abide by it?
Let's see what the legislation says.
But surely the answer has to be yes, it's the law.
Let's see what the legislation says. You're asking me about a pig in a poke, and I will wait to see what legislation the opposition may try to bring forward, but we know what their intention is.
We're in constitutional times, but for a government to say we won't abide by legislation is impossible, surely.
We will see what the legislation says when it is put forward.
But the worst thing about Michael Gove goes far beyond his sliminess, because you've all seen the most famous video of Michael Gove from the Brexit campaign, but you've probably not thought about how that affected the pandemic a few years later. Because we all know that a key element of fascism is a hostility towards experts and academics, because they have the credibility to challenge those in power. Well, it was Michael Gove who really opened that box for the Johnson regime, establishing that the will of the British people, and their freedom, as defined by him of course, was much more important than experts who should be ignored.
I think the people in this country have had enough of experts with organisations from acronyms
people of this country have had enough of experts.
From organisations with acronyms saying that they know what is best and getting it consistently wrong.
And then when the pandemic came and it was the government's job to restrict people's freedom by telling them to listen to experts, Boris Johnson locked down late in what the Parliament's inquiry called one of the worst public health failures in UK history. For example, on the exact same day that SAGE, an expert body with an acronym, was saying that we shouldn't shake hands because of coronavirus, Boris Johnson was saying it was okay to shake hands with COVID patients.
I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody, you'll be pleased to know, and I continue to shake hands, and I think it's very important that people obviously can make up their own minds. I think that Matt has said that people must make up their own minds. There is an important difference between our country and many other countries around the world, and that is our country is a freedom-loving country. And it is very difficult to ask the British population uniformly to obey guidelines in the way that it is necessary.
And those early decisions, driven by the anti-expert, pro-freedom philosophy that Michael Gove himself helped unleash, caused about 30,000 avoidable deaths. And that's not me saying that, Michael Gove himself said it. But being the king of slime, he tried to shift the blame onto Boris Johnson.
A decision to restrict freedoms in an unprecedented way went against his instincts and the principles that governed his political outlook.
And as for being the king of slime, you've all seen my video with Michael Gove where I went head-to-head with him, asking him whether or not Brexit has damaged the country and made us poorer. Yeah, I'll put the link if you haven't, but may he never know rest or peace. Andrea Leadsom, she gave us another lesson in fascism, a key part of which is treating anybody with an opposing viewpoint as being less patriotic than you.
We had various different EU politicians, the elected politicians, saying it's a good start. Of course it's very early days, but it would be helpful. It would be helpful if broadcasters were willing to be a bit patriotic. The country took a decision. This government is determined to deliver on that decision.
Are you accusing me of being unpatriotic for questioning how negotiations are going, questioning whether you have the position of strength that she said she wanted?
But where do you draw the line? Because while they would call people like us unpatriotic for not believing in Brexit, I would definitely argue that Tories aren't patriotic because they knowingly caused catastrophic damage to the country for their own political gain. But maybe she's not a fascist. Maybe she genuinely believed that Brexit was best for the country and that her opponents, Remainers, were actively trying to destroy the country. Yeah, no, because this was her in 2013.
I'm going to nail my colours to the mast here. I don't think the UK should leave the EU. I think it would be a disaster for our economy, and it would lead to a decade of economic and political uncertainty at a time when the tectonic plates of global success are moving.
So she knew with an absolute certainty that leaving the EU would be a disaster for the UK and deliver the years of economic damage and uncertainty that we're currently living through, on top of a cost of living crisis. And yet she became one of the leaders of the Vote Leave campaign. And when the damage that she predicted to happen actually actually happened. She accused anybody who called that out of being unpatriotic. That is what makes her a fascist. Wielding the concept of patriotism as a sword to swing at anybody who challenges you, even when you know you're wrong. And so many politicians from the Brexit-supporting parties have admitted that Brexit is damaging the country and that they plan to make it worse, and yet they still call their critics unpatriotic. We need to remember what patriotism actually is. Doing your best to improve the lives of people in your country, whilst also maintaining your country's moral reputation by not behaving poorly towards other countries. Patriotism is not pushing for policies that you know will ruin the lives of millions of your own citizens. So Andrea Leadsom, may she never know rest or peace. Nadine Dorries. One has to question whether Nadine Dorries was ever actually a real human being or just a Boris Johnson fan account that grew legs and teeth. Like, never has there been such a devoted fan of another politician. Like, she loved him beyond reason, and I mean that literally. Like, her defences of him would often reveal the most damaging truths about him and the Conservative Party. Like, during the COVID inquiry, which looked into why we locked down so late and had so many tens of thousands of avoidable deaths, she said this about Boris Johnson, thinking it made him look good.
When the information he was permanently being given was, you have to lock down, this is what you have to do. And I think he was a bit of a lone voice at times, saying, but we can't absolutely destroy the economy. We can't keep children at home. I think he was at times the only voice raising those concerns. The vast majority of voices, from the scientific advisors, the medical advisors, Labour MPs, Conservative MPs, everybody, journalists, the media, was locked down.
Or when MPs were trying to get rid of Boris Johnson and she said,
the Conservative Party donors have said themselves that they aren't going to support the party if the Prime Minister is removed. I think a number of MPs in marginal seats need to hear that and need to understand what they're doing. £18 million those donors have donated to the Conservative Party over recent times. It's those donors that have helped us to win the election, and they need to hear that message.
Like, she was on TV saying that the Conservative Party decides who gets to run the country based on which billionaire gives them the most money. Taking money in exchange for making major political decisions is the definition of corruption, and she just said it on Sky News. And that's even more interesting when you think about the £1.9 million in Russia-linked donations that have funded the Conservative Party. It's therefore no wonder that the Russia report said the government actively avoided looking into Russian interference in UK referendums and elections. And given the £3.5 million they've received from fossil fuel companies and climate deniers, their continued licensing of oil fields kinda makes sense. So Nadine Dorries also taught us that we need stricter rules on party financing. May she never know rest or peace. Owen Paterson, he expanded that principle because he was being paid £112,000 by private companies to push for policies on their behalf. Now, in politics, we call that lobbying. In the real world, we call that bribery. If you get paid hundreds of thousands of pounds to abuse the trust of your elected position, that's bribery. And if you're being paid 80 grand by the public as your salary as an MP, but you're getting £112,000 from private companies, who's your real boss? You would stand to gain more by going against the public in favour of private companies. And it's not just that he had zero remorse for this, it's that after he was found guilty of what the Parliament inquiry said was the most prolific case of paid lobbying in UK history, the majority of Tory MPs voted to change the rules to let him off. So that is six-figure bribery of an elected official, and the majority of Tory MPs not just supporting him, but changing the rules to help him get away with it. That's aiding and abetting bribery by any reasonable person's definition. So Owen Paterson helped us prove that the majority of Tory MPs are just posh criminals. May he never know rest or peace. Neil Parish. Now sometimes we get warnings. Like, I remember seeing this clip of Neil Parish and thinking, okay, that guy's definitely a walking red flag when it comes to sexism.
Starting with ladies first. Karen, please, if you'd like to introduce yourself for the record, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Karen Betts, Chief Executive of the Food and Drink Federation.
Welcome here this afternoon. I understand this is the first time you've come before select committees to give evidence, so we will try and be firm with you, but kind, hopefully, this afternoon. So
I've been the first time at this committee.
Right. Good. Thank you very much for coming today. Richard, please.
But we are confident the physical infrastructure will be ready. Others may have a view on the staffing, of course.
So what, the actual structures are built then, are they?
Pretty much, yeah.
And are they, and I suppose they won't naturally be manned necessarily until, or personed until...
And then a few weeks later, he was caught in Parliament watching what one can only assume was tractor porn.
So to be clear, on at least one occasion, you were blatantly viewing pornography on your mobile phone in the chamber of the House of Commons.
Yeah, funnily enough, it was tractors I was looking at, and so I did get into another website that had a sort of very similar name, and I watched it for a bit, which I shouldn't have done. But my biggest crime, is that on another occasion I went in a second time.
And that was deliberately?
And that was deliberate.
Like, imagine having to explain to your kids that after causing tens of thousands of avoidable deaths during COVID, committing 126 lockdown offences during the pandemic, delivering a Brexit that's done more damage to our economy than the pandemic itself, apparently the best tool for getting rid of a Tory MP is the agricultural category on Pornhub. But on a serious note, here's Neil Parish arguing that we should starve the people of the UK as a negotiating tactic against the EU.
And what we found is that the food chain is a just-in-time food chain, and it works well if you can get things through the border. So my sort of question to you very much is that if we have an Australian-type deal in January with a basic no deal, our key supply routes across the Channel will be disrupted at the time of year when we heavily rely on imports. About 90% of lettuce, 80% of tomatoes, and 70% of our soft fruit comes through at that time. So given the best estimate by government, the reduction by 1/3 of imports across the Channel could be due to border checks. So surely, if they're playing very hard ball at the moment, we should actually put tariffs on absolutely everything that comes in, because that will bring us to then, will it not, to a negotiating position where we can actually get a tariff-free deal. So will you commit to putting reciprocal tariffs on EU imports if we don't reach a free trade agreement with the EU? Because it's essential if we're going to maintain production in this country and also get a deal with the Europeans.
Neil, you're quite right.
So you will commit to
we certainly will, of course. I mean, the tariff schedule has been published, and you'll be familiar with it.
And remember, with the Tories basically wiped out in this election and the Reform Party looking to take their place, they're also pushing for a no-deal Brexit, which they've also admitted would significantly damage our food supply. So we need to learn the lessons from Tories like Neil Parish. Just because somebody talks with a posh accent doesn't mean they're not a dangerous extremist that will starve your family. May he never know rest or peace. Chris Pincher, or Pincher by name, Pincher by nature according to Boris Johnson, had several allegations of groping upheld against him. There's not much to learn from him other than the fact that it was Boris Johnson knowingly promoting him to Deputy Chief Whip of the party, i.e. in charge of party discipline, knowing he had several allegations of sexual misconduct that ultimately brought down Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. But nevertheless, may he never know rest or peace. Scott Benton, he's just a nasty piece of work. Not just that he offered to do paid lobbying for gambling companies within Parliament, but also fat-shaming of the public. May he never know rest or peace. Peter Bone, another wrong'un, kicked out for sexual misconduct. May he never know rest or peace. Yeah. I honestly stopped writing. I didn't bother with notes for this because you know most of it already. I'm going to focus on the stuff that you might not have thought about. Like, what he did to the Conservative Party was so damaging because before 2016, you could have decent arguments. Like, on the left, you'd have people saying we want more equality. On the right, you'd say no, you're just going to let the market do its thing and it'll ultimately work out. And you could at least have decent arguments with the common ground of knowing that both sides wanted the best for people. You wanted to improve people's quality of life. You just had different ideas about how to get there. But what Boris Johnson did by pushing for Brexit knowing it would hurt people, and then even firing any Tory MP that refused to go for a no-deal Brexit. And let's be clear what no-deal Brexit is. There is no other major economy in the world that doesn't have significant amounts of trade deals with its closest neighbours. So by no-deal Brexit, we mean doing something that every successful economy on the planet has chosen specifically not to do. So he got rid of every Conservative politician that wasn't willing to completely destroy the country. So the idea of the left and right having decent, compassionate, understanding conversations about how to improve the country, that died with him. And he knew he was damaging the country because in 2011 and 2013...
London is out there. It is ahead of Dubai and Mumbai and Moscow and Buenos Aires. And that is because we have a young, growing, highly skilled population. We're not just a valued and, by the way, fully paid up member of the EU, which we will remain. And we will remain a paid up, valued, participating member of the single market. And there is, under no circumstances, in my view, will a British government adjust that position.
How would you vote tomorrow if there was a referendum?
I'd vote to stay in the single market. I'm in favour of the single market. I want us to be able to trade freely with our European friends.
So this was the man that knew that his Brexit would ruin the lives of millions of people. And yet when MPs in Parliament were begging him to stop using such violent and aggressive language because it was endangering them, leading to death threats against them, this was his response.
And we stand here, Mr. Speaker, under the shield of our departed friend, with many of us in this place subject to death threats and abuse every single day. And let me tell the Prime Minister that they often quote his words: surrender act, betrayal, traitor. And I, for one, am sick of it. We must moderate our language, and it has to come from the Prime Minister first.
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
As the woman who has taken over a seat that was left by our dear friend Joe Cox, can I ask him, in all honesty, as a human being, please, will he, going forward, moderate his language so that we will all feel secure when we're going about our jobs?
Is that the best way to honour the memory of Joe Cox, and indeed the best way to bring this country together would be, I think, to get Brexit done. And the best way to ensure that every parliamentarian is properly safe, and we dial down the current anxiety in this country, is to get Brexit done.
The man told an MP who only had her seat in Parliament because Joe Cox was murdered during Brexit that the best way to avoid being murdered like Joe Cox was to support his policy of Brexit. That is literally weaponizing death threats against MPs to get your own way. The man has literally zero morality. And we can talk about the racism he stoked and the bigotry that he provoked, but ultimately he doesn't care. It's all just a game for him. The question is, how did he become our Prime Minister? Because so many people in the Conservative Party just said, yeah, we'll go with this. They were all happy to stand behind that utter monster in 2019. And now that it's been an utter disaster for the country and for them, they're trying to just slink off into private life and not face the judgment of voters. And that's why we're gathered here today. And it's great to see all the people who will deeply miss the Conservative Party. Because it's bad enough that we allowed this to happen to us in the first place. It's doubly bad that they're being allowed to just slink away and face none of the justice that any of us would face if we robbed the country of billions by lying. But it would be a third strike if we didn't learn the lessons from this. So, given that everything that's happened over the last 14 years could be said to be a result of the Blair government not doing enough for working class people, especially in the north, leading people to look elsewhere, and him going back on his promise to ditch this voting system that consistently gives us governments that are more right-wing than the actual people, the priority after this election has to be getting Keir Starmer to A, help working class people, and that will involve rejoining the EU single market, and B, give us a voting system where all votes count equally. This will give us the tools we need to fight back against politicians like Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. That being said, while the votes are being counted, I will be partying with some people that you know quite well. And I'll be sharing stuff from that, and I might even go live at some point during the night, so keep an eye out for that. But for now, I'm Femi. Make sure you follow F Politics, so politics doesn't F you. Have a great Tory funeral.